Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Cortex. My name is Cody, and I'd love to welcome you back to Techstrong Learning, where we have another exciting presentation for you. Before we get things kicked off, we do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review. First, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or maybe share with a friend. The on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude this live session today. If you'd like to engage with us, there are a couple of options for you to do so. The first way that you can engage with us is the chat tab. That chat tab can be found on the right side of your screen, and I'd like you to go ahead and start testing that out for us right now by letting us know from where in the world you are tuning in. I know we have a global audience, and we've got our speakers in different parts of the country today as well. So let's get a sense on where everyone is joining. If you do have any specific questions, we would like you to send those into the Q&A tab on the right side of the chat screen. Sending in your questions to that Q&A tab just helps make sure that we can get to them and address them during our Q&A portion. So feel free to send in as many questions as you'd like. Finally, before we close things out today, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around to find out if you're one of our lucky winners. Our conversation today is about your IDP playbook, best practices for internal developer portals. I'm joined today by Lauren Craigie, Head of Product and Market Research at Cortex, and Mike Moore, Head of Solutions Engineering at Cortex. So Lauren and Mike, thank you both so much for joining us today on Learning. Lauren, would you like to go ahead and take it away from here?
Yes, thank you so much for the nice introduction there. Hi, everybody. I'm Lauren Craigie. I look after research and product marketing at Cortex, which is an internal developer portal. Probably all you really need to know about me for the purposes of this webinar, but I will also share that I'm tuning in from Bozeman, Montana, not for very long. We're actually moving to Reno, Nevada this weekend, thus the lack of personality on my walls, and maybe also my face because I'm pretty exhausted from packing. So luckily, Mike's going to be doing a lot of the talking today, and I'm going to pass it over to him for a quick intro.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. And I'm Mike Moore. I'm the head of our sales engineering team here at Cortex. I actually came in as our founding solutions engineer, and we've been watching the team grow and working with mountains of different folks throughout different industries and different places. Come from interesting places like CA technologies back in the day before microservices were cool. And then found my way through Datadog and Splunk, where I got to have the pleasure of leading the solutions engineering organizations out, excuse me, in Asia Pacific, out of Australia. So spent a bit of time there, and then found my way back here to Cortex pretty recently. So excited to talk a bit more about our best practices, Chad, here. But Lauren, I'll turn it back over to you for some agendas and what we're going to talk about here.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike. Okay. So let's talk about what's on tap here for today. We're going to talk a bit about why IDPs, why now. I specifically want to cover that because a lot of the market factors that are in play right now are really starting to shape how IDPs are being built, which would influence then how you're thinking about actually deploying them. We're also going to introduce a concept that we use to map adoption of technology against the phases of engineering maturity. And we're going to do that actually as part of our first observation on how to improve your approach. We're then going to follow that with 4 more lesser talked about mistakes that we see in the field, as well as how we recommend rethinking strategy for each one. But before we get started on that, we really have to take a little bit of time to talk about developer productivity to make sure we're all on the same page here. Developer productivity is the speed and efficiency with which developers build reliable software, probably a surprise to no one there. But this is really what's driving a lot of interest in IDPs today, which is in turn shaping how these platforms are actually being built. So that's great, but what's driving an insane increase in interest in developer productivity lately? Gartner just cited that they saw a 325% increase in inquiries on this topic, which is pretty wild. And I think that's because we're at this very unusual moment in our economic and innovation timeline that I wanted to take a few minutes to talk through right now. First up, spoiled surprise here. First up is that the pandemic eliminated a lot of companies in overcrowded markets, leaving steeper competition, tighter resources for everybody. I'm sure that everybody on this call has felt the crunch from the pandemic. And we know that dev velocity is still key to staying ahead of the competition, but we also see significant upturn in how many engineering leaders are now concerned about displacement from faster moving competitors. We also have this particular point in our innovation timeline where we have two big shifts happening right now that I want to talk through. One is the shift to microservices, and the other is widespread adoption of Kubernetes. Both were accelerated by remote work, which is what we just talked about, and both enable devs to ship code faster, which is great. Maybe it solves the problem, but increased optionality and complexity with these shifts has a pretty big knock-on effect. Two big knock-on effects. One is there's not a lot of guardrails yet to ensure quality at scale, and two, a steep learning curve for the right way to do things kind of reduces the amount of resources you have to actually help. And then the third thing here is that both of these are putting enormous pressure on devs to be more productive, aka ship quality code faster and cheaper. And I say that a bit tongue in cheek because that's actually what business leaders are now saying is the number one goal of dev productivity, not better conditions for devs, which actually rank the lowest on the list of priorities, but faster output. And of course, that's going to be at odds with what devs feel they need the most right now, which is really to go slow to go fast, right? To actively collaborate with peers, to have learning experiences, get feedback, professional development. And all of these things are additive to a company over time, but historically have come at a short-term cost of shipping speed. So the problem we face now that's complicating the pursuit of developer productivity is that to avoid losing devs at a time when we really can't afford to lose them, orgs need to deliver better experiences in a way that also helps them raise the bottom line. Super simple, right? These factors don't actually need to be in conflict, though. Internal developer portals emerge to improve collaboration for engineers without sacrificing speed or quality. How convenient, right? Product marketing person from Cortex and IDP. Not difficult for me to come to this conclusion. But before I lose you, I just want to acknowledge that this isn't easy. Mike and I know this is not easy. We're not here to tell you that there's 3 steps to developing your IDP and it's to just buy Cortex. In fact, we're not going to talk about Cortex at all until the very last slide of this presentation if you'll humor us for that small amount. But we do want to talk about what we've seen in market today. We've talked to a lot of folks that are struggling to build their IDPs. We've talked to a lot of folks that are able to have faster success than others. And we've really studied why that disparity actually exists. So we wanted to take some time today to talk through what we see going right, what we see going wrong, and then our suggestions for how to kind of improve your process. And this is whether or not you plan to build your own IDP or whether you're shopping around for one, whether you're going to use an open source solution. We think that these tips should apply to everybody universally. So hopefully everybody gets something out of this presentation. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Mike for our first mistake that we've seen so far in market.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, so we're going to go through a few of these today. And one of the core things that we see in Truly, so, as coming to Cortex and having done this over and over and over again with, dozens, maybe well over 100 different companies or organizations now, we see that people often skip foundations, right? There's a lot of, trying to optimize early on. Hey, we want to go low no code. We want to do all of this stuff really fast and we want to move really quick. And we found that, and I love this analogy, right? It's a lot like building a house, right? If we skip the foundational element, if we do a poor job pouring that foundation, and I don't know how many of you have all experienced this, but I've had several friends of mine who've built a house and the foundation is cracked or tilted or incorrect. And no matter how well that house is built on top, right? And the service architecture is exactly the same way. Developer portals are exactly the same way. If you have a poor foundation, the walls are going to crack, the pipes are going to burst, things are going to slow down. It becomes very hard to build and build quickly and build reliably. So we see a lot of optimization a little too early. But Lauren, if we could hop to the next one. I think we love Gartner, so no shade here, right? But this particular slide has really caused a little bit of confusion kind of in the market. And they've done this fantastic writing and research on these IDPs that are really out in front of the pack. But if we think about this diagram, right, the order of operations that are implied, we've seen this cause a lot of confusion, right, in the market. So in the full report, right, it suggested that, hey, our very first step in deploying is we want to discover existing things and create new templates for developers to build new things, right? as a best practice. And the problem is step 2 here is, okay, then we need to deploy that, and then we're going to improve upon it. And this is all really good. It sounds awesome in practice or in theory, right? But this lets you kind of attack a developer use case, right, while also getting the velocity you need, but hypothetically all through standards and better quality. It's a little jumbled though, right? We want to put cataloging out of the same step, right, as building, right? Because essentially what that means is you're skipping a pretty significant step in evaluating what we already have, establishing what steps are needed to close that gap, really, and get to that ideal state. So in order to get there, right, we want to set minimum standards, right? We want to be able to see everything and get it. And this is a foundational element we talk about, right? We want to be able to not just scale, but ensure that quality at scale. And the way that we tend to look at this is steps 1 and 2 here, right? Aggregating all of our data, not just centralizing service and resource data, but treating ownership as a core concept, making sure we've got all the right tools in place, making sure that we have all of the data that's available to us, not just the observability tool, not just the documentation, not just my API specs. We want it all in the same place, right? So then we can turn to the next step here and start to assess, right? Where are we at? Are we doing well in terms of production readiness? Are we doing well in terms of service maturity or our security standards or compliance, right? There's tons of initiatives and tons of different things that touch service architecture and developers and engineering organizations. And truly, we want to understand what our minimum requirements are, and we want to set that frame, right? This is like, taking a GPS out, right? It's going to find you the optimal route to get where you want to go, right? And as an organization, this is super important for us to think about as we begin to assess our architecture and where it lives. So moving from here, right, then we want to start to improve the experience, right? Now that we understand where the chips have fallen, how well we're doing against the standards we've set, or maybe how well we're not doing, and it just depends, on the organization. We want to start to take a few extra steps. We want to make sure that we can prescribe and drive that action, right? We want to say, hey, look, we found this organizational gap. We found this departmental gap. Now we want to take that and drive an actual, output or outcome from a developer, from a service owner to, increase the, odds of them meeting those standards, to improve the best practices, to maybe, improve on something like code coverage or something like, maybe we've got critical vulnerabilities or medium level vulnerabilities we want to attack. Right? Knowing where those gaps are and then knowing that you can attack them organizationally is pretty useful. And then incentivizing those developers to take some action, right? Providing tooling. So this is where we start to think about that low code, no code piece, but we can't get there, right, without the frame in place, right? Without being able to, set those guide points, right? And then we want to speed that time to market, right? And the key to this is really important, right? We want to be able to optimize, not just, hey, let's move quickly, hey, let's go low no code. We want to make sure that when we optimize, we have that frame in place, because we want to build to the frame, right? We want, if you go all the way back to folks like, Mel Conway and those guys, right, that started the whole microservices movement, right? It's all about speed and scale with safety. The problem is if we don't assess and prescribe, if we don't take those two kind of, fundamental steps, and we don't have a catalog that's really well organized and in place, it's a really, really good way to build more tech debt than you've ever built in your life, and it's in a record time, right? It's a really interesting, conundrum, because at that point you've kind of defeated the purpose of moving this developer portal. So this is one of the reasons that we see this kind of maturity curve, if you will, right? This journey that we see people go on. If you do it right, you can really move. It might take a minute to get that initial foundation set up, but then you can start to move super quick and know that, hey, we built this new thing, we're right in place with where we need to be, and we can start to move very quickly. And then from here, right, Lauren, I think there's the next slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly call out here that you will notice that the pillar for improving developer experience starts in the middle here. It doesn't have to begin at the end. We have a lot of customers that come to us saying, I know that I want a catalog and I know that I want scaffolder. If you're not familiar with what scaffolding might be, it's creating services or resources with templates. So they know that they want those two things because they really prioritize developer experience. But the misstep here is that you really don't have to wait until the end of the equation to begin developer experience. It starts with access to information. It begins with quickly understanding the work products of other teams, having a clear understanding of what other teams need to be successful. reducing fire drills by reducing the rate of incidents from outdated or non-compliant components. All of these improve the day-to-day work for individual developers. But it's important to kind of follow this progression of cataloging, determining what good actually looks like before you get to a step where you're actually speeding production of new services.
Awesome. So this is what we call the engineering maturity curve, right? And truly, when we execute in a meaningful, deliberate order, right? And we think this order here in particular, this is when we see that click over to real cultural change, right? Because nobody's introducing a developer portal to go, we just want a repository, right? Oftentimes, this effort is driven by, hey, we want standards and we want accountability, we want visibility, we want that, call it observability plus, right? It's not just your observability tools, but it's everything else that goes with it, right? Where the standards are then assumed because your accountability is high and the tools, right, are there and we can operate really well and all this stuff is readily available, right? We're going to go back and we can work through this flow and we can begin to iterate. But the nice thing is we can start to drive that cultural change and get people where we want to very quickly, right? Very easily. It's all about being deliberate, I think, in how we build this out, right? Which is why we kind of started here, and we'll kind of refer back to this throughout kind of the rest of the presentation.
One more thing I wanted to stress here is that we believe that this is the direction that all IDPs are going to start to follow as well. This doesn't need to be particular to Cortex. This is something that we found success with just speaking to a lot of different engineering teams and helping them figure out where exactly do you sit. This seems to click with a lot of folks that we've spoken to. It seems to be the order of operations as they see that they'd like to progress across this plane of maturity. But this can easily be used for anybody who's maybe even building your own IDP or potentially even evaluating a different solution just to help you frame your thinking. I also just saw a question come in. I don't see names. I can just see participant 437. And it's about the comprehensiveness of the catalog. We will get to that at the end of the presentation. But I know that, Mike, that you are planning to speak to that anyways. So I'm just going to keep rolling a bit. Oh, Mike, there you are in the chat.
I'm already in it. So there we go.
Mistake number 2 then.
Awesome. Well, in fact, it's a perfectly timed participant 437. I do love the names. Right. So this is exactly what we're going to talk about. This, like, waiting to map information is oftentimes, it gets a little delayed, right? And I think I can speak to exactly what I just wrote there in the channel. Right. Building that information architecture is probably a little harder than you think, right? Because there's two kind of propensities, right? And I'll go through this a little bit more in detail, where people tend to either not put enough information in the catalog or they go the opposite route, right? And you think back to the microservices concept of, hey, we want to build to, a functional unit. Well, if you build a car, right, you're not going to build a service for every screw and every belt and every pulley and every wheel. You're going to build an engine. You're going to build a transmission. You're going to build the air conditioning units and I'm having issues here with my analogy, but point being, right, we want to build those functional units. And so as we build the catalog, we do want to think about not over rotating, but you also want to make sure that you have relevant KPIs and information, other things like that. And truly speaking, right, so we've done some market research here, right, of what we find is that the people that are really struggling haven't aligned internally on that information architecture, like who's important, like what's important, why did we bring this in? Maybe we don't need to bring every metric coming in from my Datadog instance, for example. Maybe we just need those few KPIs as an example, or maybe we need this signal from security and this signal from SRE and so on. Awesome. Let's hop to the next slide if we can. So, perfect. There we go. So a few questions we're going to ask ourselves here, right? And as we build, right, we're going to build up here, right? So what components do we have? What do we care most about, right? That's that, again, keeping in mind, we don't want to over rotate and build too small, right? So the next step from here, right, is how do we group this stuff, right? What domain or product, component does this fit in? What are the dependencies here? Are they upstream? Are they downstream? Where do they live? How do we map that stuff, right? And then we want to continue to think about maybe things like, what do we monitor? And monitoring's funny because you got the SRE team says we monitor, and the network team says we monitor, and then you've got security that says we monitor. There's a lot of stuff to monitor. And what are we alerting on? Are we alerting on SLOs? Are we alerting on dependencies that are like packages that are maybe out of date. That whole log4j thing, for example, was just a nightmare for everyone. So what are we alerting on? What do we bring in? Right. And then finally, kind of, what do we want to report, right? What are we looking at, right? Oftentimes, and one of the reasons that Cortex came about was the dreadful spreadsheet, right? Everybody has one because they've got reporting for production readiness or service maturity or security and compliance, and et cetera, et cetera. But then the question becomes, well, how often should we be reporting, right? And who needs to see this reporting, and who's really going to drive that change from the organization? Is it a manager? Is it a director? Is it the VP, the CEO, CTO, right? Who's driving some of this organizational change? So if we really think through this, right, there's a lot of questions we need to ask ourselves as we're assessing what actually belongs here and what do we bring in. But really, truly, if we go back to that maturity curve and we think about the foundational elements, these two questions: what components do we have, and what are the dependencies? If you're thinking past these two already, like, you're already ahead, right? But it comes down to, we really want to make sure that we're focused on kind of being deliberate about each one of these questions and understanding which KPIs we need to bring in, what's actually important, how do we measure today, and then how do we want to report this up to the right folks. But these are truly, I'd say, if you can start here and then start to ask those questions on top of them, you'll start to be able to build a much easier foundation, right? And really get that step 1, step 2 in place. And so how do we make this faster, right? Because a lot of people are going to look at that and go, that's a lot of work. I hear that almost every time I talk to anyone about developer portals. And truly, that's born out of a lot of pain, right? There's a lot of manual updating today, right? That spreadsheet I mentioned, maybe it's Confluence pages or Jira tickets, or I've heard Post-it notes. I've heard all kinds of wacky stuff where people track all of this information, sometimes not at all. Content management, how do we actually keep all of this stuff in order? How do we think about ownership that's now tracked in 12 different places, and those multiple views, right? Where we've got, my favorite question I have every time I talk to someone new is, well, how many single panes of glass do you own today? I can't hear anybody on the other end, but hopefully a few folks got a good laugh out of that, because most of the time we all have several single panes of glass. I know I've sold tons of them back in the day, right? Back in my days with observability and other places. So the true, heart of this is we need to kind of, and I hate the word shift left, shift right, but we're going to shift right over here on the slide, right? And we want to start to think about, how do we auto discover some of this stuff? How do we synchronize data effortlessly without having to integrate at every single point and shift data here or shift data there or make a bunch of modifications? How do we do this in a as automated fashion as possible, right? How do we then turn around and treat this catalog as code, right? Can we work on the GitOps type model? Can we, keep change management in mind as we work through this stuff? How do we take ownership and make it a central concept? Because all of this information, as good as it may be, means absolutely nothing if you don't know who's responsible, right? And at the end of the day, we want to integrate everything, right? We want to bring in those different sources of truth, right? Those different single panes, right? And we want to turn it into, again, I've got all these great analogies, right? We want it to be a piece of stained glass, right? And each picture, right, is going to look a little different for every organization because you have different tools, you have different care abouts and KPIs. But that's the point, right? You've got all of these great data sources already, and you've spent lots of time and effort and energy and money on this stuff. Might as well leverage them full tilt and bring them all in to give people the right visibility. Awesome. So I highlighted this very briefly, but we're going to dig in real deep on this one, and that is ownership. This is one that I could probably have spoken the entire, call on this, right? In the webinar, we could have talked the whole time about ownership, and this is one of the biggest pain points out there, right? Because the bad news is this, right? Ownership's it's more than just a name, right? The good news is you can use your IDP to make this better. Truly speaking, the more folks I talk to, the more times we engage with different teams and different organizations. Ownership is such a fractured I hate to use the word mess, but it's a fractured mess, generally speaking, across the market. And oftentimes it's because we have so many different sources of truth. Maybe you've got your Okta's there, and you've got that's plugged into Google, but then maybe somewhere else in the organization you've got Active Directory over here, but that's plugged into Workday. And now we've got engineering over here that says, no, we manage all our teams in GitHub Teams. It's complicated, right? There's all of these permutations and iterations of ownership. And one of the biggest challenges is if I go back to thinking about that foundational element, right, that we talked about at the beginning, this is where I think it gets super important to think critically about ownership and how we manage ownership internally at an organization and how we track the movements of staff and people. Because at the end of the day, if Lauren and I are on a team, but she goes to some other team, or she leaves the company, or maybe somebody joins our team, A, we want the new people to be able to see what's going on. B, we don't need the people who have left the team to be bothered with the noise. And C, if there's an incident or if there's an outage or if there's a problem, we want to know, right, who do we talk to and who's responsible, not so we can go give them a hard time, but so we can know who we speak to. And all of this comes back to the reference architecture, right? All of these pieces and parts, all of these single panes of glass that we were looking at on this screen funnel back into your IDP, right? And so whether we're thinking about, the service and resource catalog, whether we're thinking about, hey, scorecards or, the reporting side of this, where we can actually measure what's going on and then assess maybe against, again, the organization, maybe a department, maybe a subset of the department, whether we're thinking about, who owns these particular sets of plugins or this particular scaffolder here, like all this stuff has to work together and account for ownership in a really meaningful way. So let's talk about a few common ownership mistakes, right? This is my favorite one, right? Everybody goes, oh, we have a new IDP that we can make our IDP, capital D, little d, right? It's a very funny term, but look, don't reinvent the wheel. Don't add to the complexity and I would say issues that come with now just another source of truth, right, for ownership. Ownership, they're solved in great ways with companies like Workday and Okta and Azure Active Directory and all of these things. They've got great mechanisms to do this. So wherever you're doing this, right, I think this is where we find people look at their ownership strategy and go, yep, we're going to go fix ownership and we're going to make it consistent, right? But truly speaking, don't add another pain point, right? Because it's just going to cause more problems and one more place to manage and one more thing to do. And so instead of actually solving for something, you're probably creating an additional problem here by having a new inconsistent, map. So your IDP should think about your identity provider, right? As the source of truth, right? Your group management, your HRIS system should be that source of truth, because truly that's managed at the, your HR systems are managing that, maybe your engineering teams are managing that. But whether it's GitHub teams that you settle on, or whether it's Workday, or whether it's Okta or Azure, wherever you put it, highly recommend kind of consolidating that and then let your IDP follow your organizational structure naturally. Awesome. This is always fun too, right? Trying to complete all of this stuff pre-IDP, right? One thing that's really cool about reporting and about things like scorecarding and measuring against a service architecture is we can identify our gaps. So, using the IDP to set up to identify gaps is kind of the best thing I think you could do, because that will show you where the holes are, right? You can take a good wild stab at it, but most of the time, until you really put something in place, it's really hard to find, hey, do we have a gap here or a gap there? Unless you're going to go look through every code owner file you've got, or that spreadsheet that's now 4, 6, 12 months out of date. It becomes a big challenge. So I'd say, use that tool, right? Use the platforms like the IDPs to help you kind of assess that lay of the land. Finally, look, inconsistent ownership paths, right? Like I mentioned up front, define your ownership in the model you operate in. Don't, again, going back to point one, don't reinvent the wheel. Don't try to come up with a creative new ownership model. I think because like I said, at the end of the day, you're going to end up having a lot more problems if you're trying to just define a brand new model, right? Your organization has grown. It's probably gotten fairly large. It's got well-established practices for this. The best thing to do is play in the sandbox. And then finally, assuming ownership. Oh, go ahead.
All right, you already said finally. I'm just poking funny.
Oh, there we go. Oh, I did. All right, my apologies. So, right, assuming ownership's just a name, right? This is the thing that incentivizes accountability, right, for all of your assets, whether it's a database, whether it's a cache, whether it's a, you know, it's just one of those interesting things where as long as we know who owns this thing, right, this is a really key component, because without the accountability, without the visibility, and without kind of an organizational structure, we have a really hard time, especially at any reasonable organizational scale, getting down into, who needs to operate to fix something, or, who owns this thing and how do we fix it, right? There's all kinds of challenges just not knowing, who's responsible for what asset. All right. Cool.
We're gonna sorry, I just figured I would just take this one since I had that small bit there.
Sure.
At the end. Yeah. So mistake 4 here, poor stakeholder management. Really quickly before I hand it back over to Mike, I wanted to talk about a phrase that you've probably heard before. If you are a developer, don't ship your org chart. If you haven't heard that phrase, what it refers to is don't let your product be a reflection of the gaps that you have in communication across your business, or an attitude of that wasn't my responsibility, therefore I'm not going to worry about it. When it comes to building an IDP, the same principle applies. You have to balance bringing in the right people to have conversations about what they're looking for in terms of creating standards for operational excellence, security standards, compliance standards, deployment readiness. You also want to balance that with maybe not having too many cooks in the kitchen. I know that can be kind of a frustrating process. We do have a recommendation for how you can start to attack these use cases over time, and I'll bring it back to Mike to show you what that looks like.
Awesome. So yeah, this is also another kind of core thing that we often see. And interestingly enough, people always ask, who buys IDPs? And I'd say the answer is it depends on who found the problem first. It's not always engineering. It's always DevX. It's not always SRE teams. It's not always security. It's generally speaking, somebody's found this issue, and it's painful enough that they've said, we've got to solve for this, because I don't have time to go after these spreadsheets every week. I don't have time to track this down. I actually don't know how to track some of this stuff down, right? Maybe there's too many data sources or issues or challenges. And so one of the things that we often find is that people will kind of go down the rabbit hole, right? And I think this is where pausing for just a moment to think about the varying stakeholders in the organization that are going to be affected by something like a well put together developer portal is pretty critical, right? Because if you think about all of the use cases that could be done, right? That's fine, but what are the actual priorities? Like, what is, what from an organizational perspective, is it developer efficiency? Is it, security standards? Is it compliance? Is it PII? We've found all kinds of folks coming to the table, and those initiatives are often driven somewhere at the top, right? And coming down. And so by understanding kind of who should be involved early on, like very early on, before you even start evaluating, that'll help you determine what feature sets are going to be needed. That'll be, because at some point you can go down the rabbit hole and say, great, yep, we've done this and we've figured out we need X for developer efficiency. Well, now security is excluded from this, and that becomes a tool that's, again, just a single pane of glass for a single set of users. So there's a lot of considerations, I think, up front that we always want to take, right, when we're kicking off an effort that touches so many different parts of an organization. So the way that we typically see this, right, and this is generally speaking the layers of adoption that we see, right, we start to see engineering, DevX, platform teams, security, and SRE kind of come in early stages, right? Maybe they're trying to perform some kind of audit and compliance. Maybe they want to run service maturity or production readiness and kind of do things like, hey, we want to gate a service going out the door if it doesn't meet our standards. DevX, right? They want to understand, ownership, right? Engineering needs to get that whole concept of who owns this thing, right? And who's responsible, and is our documentation, best practices up to date? All of those pieces and parts really start to show up early on with these teams right here. But as we start to kind of go to the right a bit more, what we're seeing is you're starting to engage the TPMs, right? We found the gaps, right? We know where the problems are because we're able to measure now through things like, scoring and validating our infrastructure and our service architecture. So we start to see TPMs get involved, right? They're starting to think about migrations. They're starting to think about developer onboarding, or closing some of those organizational product level gaps. They're starting to be able to identify what those are, but then drive the action against them. And then you've got DevOps that starts to get involved as well. Hey, now we have that frame in place. Now we know what our optimal, path is. And so now we want to start to work on self-service. We want to get that workflow automation in place. And again, without kind of that guide point, if we start all the way down here, this is where it starts to get really hairy, right? So when we start with the teams that go, yep, we want to build super quick, and we want to roll really fast, we always end up speaking to them, several months later, and it's, hey, we built all this stuff, and none of it's compliant, none of it works, and none of it does a thing. So it becomes a much larger effort, right? And so again, like as we kind of go this direction, that's where we start to see more of that low code, no code come into place, right? And then finally, as we get to optimization, right, this is where the PMs, the product, as a whole, begins to get involved, right? How do we increase engineering velocity? How do we make sure that we are shipping quality code that meets our standards quickly, and getting the roadblocks out of the way, and understanding what that process looks like end to end.
Before we move on to the last point that we wanted to make here, I just want to stress that this is purely an example of the way that we've seen some organizations attack ownership in phases. As Mike said in the beginning, we've seen all of these titles come to the table as being a potential owner for the IDP program. It really does come down to like who feels the pain the most. This is a flow that we tend to see maybe more often than others, but I wouldn't want anybody walking away from this and thinking, all right, TPM, I'm not going to see you for 2 months by the time we're ready for that phase. Again, bring everybody into the room for that initial kickoff meeting, decide what business priorities you have. Maybe you have a audit coming up. Maybe you're preparing for your ISO 27001. Maybe you've got a software migration that you need to do. These are the things that should take priority, and you're going to start to bring in the people that you need to have those conversations with before you get to later stages.
Awesome. So this is my favorite topic, and that's assuming adoption, right? Everybody loves the phrase, if you build it, they will come. And I've seen a lot of people build a lot of things, only to find that the room remains very empty. So, thinking through that, right, we want to understand how do we get adoption in place. Again, like we did some surveys out there, and, of the folks that kind of came back to us, right, which is at 36% or whatever the statistic was there, that struggle to build these things. About 20% of them pointed to kind of a lack of developer buy-in, right? And this gets dramatically higher for the homegrown systems, or the kind of like build it yourself, build it on top of a framework systems. And one of the biggest challenges there, and I look at this statistic and I think it's quite a bit higher. Again, it's just statistics, so I can't argue with the data, but I often feel that this is a really core problem where people are saying, hey, we can't get our developers to come, or they start strong and then they go away and they don't use this thing anymore, or there's all kinds of challenges and issues with adoption that we see. And the whole point of building this thing is to have people engaged, involved in the platform. And so the question becomes, and why is developer adoption lower than expected? And some of the core things that we hear, the biggest things that we see are a lack of visibility, right? Generally speaking, when you think about executive expectations, right? You've got all these different issues and challenges, right, with communications maybe not coming down. Maybe there's just lack of awareness about the portal itself, right? And truly, at the end of the day, there's often a lack of education. There's also kind of a lack of a bigger picture, right? What is this like? Why is this thing here, right? Is it just a dumping ground for data? Is it what's my responsibility as the developer, the service owner, the TPM, right? As the SRE team, what is my role in this thing, and where do I fit, right? And that's often kind of stems out of some of that lack of visibility, right? That's not always communicated down effectively. And then truly, there's kind of a lack of enforcement, and not just enforcement. I'm going to expand on this one too. I think it's not always just enforcement. There's also a lack of encouragement, right? There's no reason often to prioritize any one thing over another thing. I've given a list often of here's 27 or 52 things or whatever it is that you need to do in order to become your service maturity score goes up or your production readiness. And one of the biggest challenges is not only is there a lack of visibility and up-to-date visibility, excuse me, in that in developer portals in general, there's often a gap when it comes to encouraging people to achieve these things, to gamify, or to even just help people understand at a more blocky level. Hey, what does good look like? So what does the good, better, best look like? And what are my expectations? And what are the most important things? Because I'll tell you right now, if somebody gives me a list of 30 things, very first question out of my mouth is going to be, what's important? What do I need to do? And what's least important? And what's going to take that, the 80% of my time versus the 10% of my time. So there's a lot of different questions that come with that. And then frequently incomplete implementation is there, right? There's two sides to this one, actually. So it's not just an incomplete implementation, but it's also sometimes an over implementation, right? I'd say in a lot of cases, adoption is tough, primarily because you maybe don't have everything there. This leads to a complete lack of trust in the data and making sure that we've got everything in place. Where the developers deprioritize what's going on. And kind of the other thing here that's interesting is perfect is the enemy of good. Oftentimes we see people develop homegrown solutions or extend because we have to do 110% of everything we could possibly ever do. That'll take you years. It's a very big, challenging thing. And at the point of it's never good enough, your developer starts to lose interest, right? And it starts to, it starts to be much more challenging to adopt it and continue to keep the faith that this thing is going to be a strategic asset for the organization. Awesome. So finally, look, we want to set our devs up for success, right? We want to provide and enforce our standards, right, with consequences. And consequences not being like, oh, hey, bad, we're going to do this in your performance review. But consequences like, hey, man, we're not going to let you deploy this out to production because it doesn't meet production readiness standards. Hey, this gets kicked back, but here's why. We want to make integrations a first-class priority. We want to make it easy to integrate with those single panes of glass, right? We also want to prioritize notifications, right? We don't want people having to think through the 30 different things they have to do. We want to make it easy to nudge people and say, hey, here's what's up next. Here's where that production readiness needs to get to in order for you to deploy, right? Here's the next, level, if you will, of, that service maturity, right? We want to make it easy for people to understand what's going on. And then the other thing, if any of you saw somebody said they worked for L3 in the past, if you work for a big company of any kind, there's initiatives flying around everywhere about everything. And the hardest part, at least in my mind, and I can barely walk and chew gum, right, is finding out what I'm responsible for and then figuring out what I have to do, when I have to do it by, and then sometimes finding out that I didn't need to do it at all in the first place, right? And so cutting through that noise is by prioritizing the right notifications, the right people, the right time is a really critical step. Gamifying it, obviously everybody loves a good gamification strategy, right? We want to make sure that, there's that little dopamine hit, right? Let's prioritize this next thing. Hey, good job. We've got a few more things to go, right? Reporting, right? Incentivizing action through daily stand-ups, weekly stand-ups, retros, whatever it is, bringing that reporting to light and just kind of saying, hey, look, we've got, it's the Netflix principle, right? We want to shine a light on everything, right? We add some sunshine to everything. And that's a really good way to kind of get the team together and motivate people to kind of move forward, right? And we want to show here that value isn't just building new stuff, right? It's building good stuff, right? It's connecting the teams, right, to each other and helping people understand how do they fit in the larger picture into the apparatus, right? Because it's not just developers, it's not just the security teams, it's not just SRE teams, it's everybody plays like on the team, right? It's a team sport. I think that's a good way to, to frame up a really good IDP is this is it's like the team room, right? Everybody can come into the room. They all play on the same team. We all see the same data. We all operate off the same model. And that's really kind of the ideal is to drive that operational excellence amongst the team and not just your team, but the entire organization.
We're going to be coming up to some final thoughts here. So folks had questions that they had in mind so far. I know that we've been through a lot of different things, and there's probably a ton more that we didn't even scratch the surface of that you'd like to ask us about. Would love to hear those questions at the end. But I'm going to tee up Mike for this top issues and review slide.
Awesome. So we talked a bit about skipping the foundational element. We've hit on this throughout the entire piece. I can't say it enough. Don't skip the basics. I think you're going to end up finding out that you spend way too much time building the future state stuff versus, again, if you spend the time to tune the car, right, you're gonna be able to drive a lot faster. I think that's really key, right? DevX begins a long time before you go to that low code, no code implementation, right? Waiting to map the information, right? Don't wait. Don't know how else to say that other than don't sleep on your info architecture, right? Map it early, be clear and concise. Don't get too crazy, right? Don't go down to the nth degree. Hey, this is this micro thing that we built over here that is, you don't need to do that, right? Be logical about how you build it, be strategic about it, be purposeful about it. I think that's a really easy way to set good standards and good practices up front and get what you're needing out of an IDP. Right, ownership, again, can't stress this enough. I did see a question here in the chat about the ownership side. Totally hear that question, right? I think the answer to the question around, who cares who manages the HR system? Nobody really cares who manages the HR system. However, it does matter where you manage your teams, right? If it's in a code owner's file, if it's in other places like that, if it's in GitHub teams, it shouldn't matter. But I think the key is more about mapping that ownership back to your services, back to your domain architecture, your product architecture, back to the resources and the people that are responsible for maintaining those pieces. So I apologize if that wasn't terribly clear, but yeah, that at the end of the day, it's critical to know who's who in the zoo, right? And map them to your architecture. Stakeholder management, right? Got to bring everybody to the table, right? We want to understand the landscape, who needs what, right? Because we can then consider a more diverse set of needs coming up in the organization. Because the idea is, again, bring the team onto the field. And then so consider rolling out that use case inclusion by priority. Think bigger picture. And then finally, right, assuming adoption, and it's just not going to happen on its own, right? Be strategic, be deliberate, be consistent with how you educate, how you train, how you communicate, put a plan in place. I think all of that is really, really important, right? And then providing that insight and clarity into what needs to be done for service excellence, operational excellence, call it what you will. I think all of those are hypercritical to good adoption practices. Awesome. So as Lauren promised here, we get one slide here to talk briefly about Cortex and what we do. But at the end of the day, we help engineering teams accelerate the path to engineering excellence. We do this through auto-syncing your catalog and your ownership information, mapping those dependencies, defining standards through fun things like scorecards and incentivizing action, right? Building by best practice, right? We everything we've talked about today, we've designed and implemented around this, and then reporting at the right levels and helping people run that low code, no code when they get there, right? Running those next extensible pieces by extending your catalog and through plugins and some other cool things. But idea here being, we really take to heart everything we've talked about here. We're very intent and purposeful about how we build and why we build it the way we do. And so on that note, I think there's one more slide here. What's next for us? Please, we've got this fancy barcode here. Feel free to scan it, come see Cortex in action. Happy to talk to you guys a bit more about this and how it works and why we do it the way we do it and answer all the hard questions. But stay tuned for some upcoming office hours tackling more of these topics. Check out, we've got some supplementary content coming your way around, what we've seen in the field from RFPs, engineering maturity curve blog, and of course, these fantastic slides in the recording. So on that note, thank you so much everyone for coming out. I did see a couple of other questions in the channel, Lauren, if we wanted to answer those live.
Yeah, well, actually, first I saw one come in the chat here. I think everybody else would have seen this too. I'm starting with the second one. Is it wrong? The same company exists in an area of DevOps and another area that implements IDP. if I'm parsing that correctly, we have seen a lot of different structures before. We've seen DevOps be the primary owner of IDP implementation. We've seen situations where DevOps is in the same organization, but maybe it's not the primary owner, but definitely does end up getting brought into the process at some point along the line. Mike, is there anything else you wanted to add there?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. I think the thing we, as we thought through that maturity curve, one of the things that we find that's pretty interesting is we find that folks will fall oftentimes in the IDP space in just parts of it. So, and almost everybody tends to miss the incentivization gap, right? Which is right in the middle, right? That piece that takes us from, yep, we've set a frame, we've set some standards. Now we want to move it over to this. Let's get faster, let's run quicker, and let's do it. Again, speed and scale with safety. And I think short answer is I think it comes just from a lack of sometimes just knowing that all of these things are out there and that there is a way to kind of bridge that gap. But yeah, that's not abnormal for sure.
Probably in the same vein here is software engineering platform and evolution of DevSecOps.
I have mixed feelings on that. I mean, there was development, and then there was DevOps, and then there was DevSecOps, and now there's platform engineering and SRE teams. And there's short answers. I don't quite know if that's the evolution of that. My gut says there's a lot of good marketing out there that all kind of means roughly the same thing. But yeah, my thinking is, if I understand the question correctly, yeah, I'd say roughly that's probably directionally correct. Yes.
An interesting one. Sorry if I'm parsing.
Oh, please.
Are there any other expected features missing in the IDP space right now? I don't know if that means across all of IDPs or.
Yeah, I think there's some ones that occur around things like engineering metrics that occur around, maybe incident management, around some of these other like ancillary features that often would lend themselves to being in that space, right? Because a lot of that data is accessible, is available, is ready. But I'd say those are oftentimes the things that are generally missing, at least today.
Perfect, thanks. If folks already have a lot of these standards in place, maybe it was when we were talking about the maturity curve, and they've gone through the process of figuring out what their catalog should look like and what priorities should look like. Can they start with a low or no code approach that they're seeing in the market right now?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is, of course you could. The question I'd pose back to you would be, who's aware of the standards, right? And is it going to be 15 different developers creating 15 different templates? And then who's ensuring the standards are met and who's ensuring the standards are created and adhered to? I think that the biggest problem comes with, yes, we may know directionally what those standards could be, but unless you've got a way to then measure, are we doing it to the standard, and a way to ensure that we're, adhering to those things, I think you end up running back into the exact same place where you just generate more tech debt, right? And you just do it quicker, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier.
There's, I think, maybe a last one here around how IDPs enhance collaboration and communication among development teams within an organization. I just wanted to take a swag at the first half of that. Sure. Earlier in the presentation, I shared a study from, I don't want to mince this now, GitHub or GitLab. It might have been GitLab, on how developers, the challenges that they're facing right now and what they're looking for out of their next set of tooling. And the top thing that came to the list was, more time to collaborate, more time to communicate, more time for professional development. So how does an IDP actually help with some of those activities? I can share that, internally at Cortex, the way that our engineers actually use the platform is that they're able to check in on other types of services that are being created across the organization. They're able to get more context on those things. Maybe they don't necessarily need to use them on their day-to-day work, but they're looking to see how other people are building things, what standards are in place for them, how quickly those teams are actually meeting some of those standards as well, which is some of that gamification that we talked about. Just, I think, Mike, you had a good phrase about this, not a wall of shame, but a wall of fame, like providing good examples of what excellence looks like and being able to see that, across other parts of the business. closing those gaps so you feel like less than a silo sometimes if you're working on a particular product and you feel like you don't have access to end users or other parts of the business and you're not really sure what's the value of what you're creating. Opening up the aperture a bit to see what other people are working on is a huge benefit of IDPs. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Mike?
No, I think you covered it quite well.
Great. I think that that's everything. Unless you see anything.
Awesome.
Hi, Cody.
I think that's it. He's back.
Well, Lauren and Mike, while we give our audience maybe 20, 30 more seconds to send in any last second questions, let me go ahead and give away a couple of gift cards and run through a couple of reminders. So I would like to remind everyone that we've been recording, and this recording will be sent to you shortly after we conclude today. If you don't want to wait around for the recording, or maybe you just happen to lose it in your inbox, you can also find this living on the Cloud Native Now website, as well as the DevOps website. So it's cloudnativenow.com/webinars or devops.com/webinars. You can find it on both sites. The 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Iris F., Robert C., Danny M., and Colin C. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. It should make its way to you in the next 48 hours. If you don't happen to see that email, just check your spam folder in case it happens to be filtered out. And just checking for questions, guys. It looks like you knocked all of them out. So I did want to give each of you an opportunity to leave our audience with any parting remarks or any core takeaways you might think that they should have. So Lauren, do you have anything top of mind?
Pressure's on. I just want to thank folks for showing up for this. Mike and I are really excited about this. It's the first time we've done something like this together. We've collaborated on this topic a lot. We're still learning a lot from folks. So if you have follow-up questions for us you didn't feel comfortable sharing here, or you have things that maybe you thought through that you think that we should know about that would help our users as well, we'd really appreciate you getting in touch. So I think that's it. Just thank you so much for the time today. Mike, was there anything else from you?
Nope, I'm all set. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. And yeah, really appreciate the time from Techstrong here. This has been great.
Awesome. Well, thank both of you so much for joining us today. A pleasure getting to know you before and hearing you speak for the last hour. So again, thanks so much for joining us on Techstrong Learning.
Thanks, Cody. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Cody. Thanks, all.
Of course. So I'd like to thank Cortex for sponsoring our program today, and to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and I do just want to ask you to stick around for a survey that will pop up as soon as we close out. Let us know what you thought about our program today, or of course, if you have any suggestions for future programs, we want to know your thoughts. Either way, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Lauren and Mike, thanks again.
Thank you.